A 5-year-old boy is standing in the Old Bailey, and he will not stay where he is put. The clerks want him with the witnesses. The boy wants the woman in the dock, the one dressed in furs and jewelry, despite 10 months of police searching, the one the newspapers are already calling the Queen of the 40 Thieves. He climbs over the barrier toward her before anyone can stop him. And in front of a judge, a jury, and a courtroom full of people who came specifically to watch a criminal get what she deserves, Michael McGee tells Mary Carr that he loves her. The jury already knows what she is. The record will show, in a few minutes more, exactly what the law decided to do with her. Neither fact explains what is happening in that boy's face. Tonight we revisit a case the London press once called a romantic crime, though nothing about it was ever quite so simple. An all-female syndicate that ruled a stretch of London's grandest shopping streets for the better part of a century. Run for its most notorious years by a woman the department stores of the West End could never quite catch, and never quite stop wanting to catch. One gang, one queen, one courtroom scene that no one who witnessed it ever fully explained afterward. The case of Mary Carr begins in Westminster in the early 1860s, though the record cannot tell you exactly when. Even the most basic facts of her early life come to us in conflicting versions. Her own prison intake papers in 1896 gave her age in a way that implies a birth year around 1871. Other contemporaries and later researchers place her birth closer to 1862 in Smith Street, Westminster, and one prison record even lists her birthplace as America, raising the possibility that the Carr family, or Mary alone, crossed the Atlantic at some point before she reappears clearly in the London courts. None of these versions can be fully reconciled with the others, and rather than choose one and present it as settled, it is more honest to say plainly that Mary Carr entered the historical record the way she seems to have moved through most of her life, leaving behind more than one account of herself, none of them complete, all of them at least partly true. What is not in dispute is the world she was born into. Westminster in the 1860s sat close enough to Parliament and the great houses of government to see their gaslit windows at night, and far enough from their comforts to feel the distance every single day. It was a district of casual labor, overcrowded courts, and an economy that ran for thousands of women and girls on work that paid just enough to survive and never enough to save. Selling flowers on street corners was one of the few trades open to a girl with no family money and no formal education, respectable enough to avoid outright criminal suspicion, precarious enough that a bad week of weather or a police crackdown on street vending could mean no food at all. It was into exactly this world of flower girls, costermongers, and casual daily wages that the syndicate, later known to newspapers as the 40 Thieves, and to a later generation as the 40 Elephants, first took shape in the streets around the Elephant and Castle in South London. The gang's name first appears in newspaper print in 1873, describing an organized network of women shoplifters operating out of the Elephant and Castle district, though the group itself is believed to have existed in some looser form even before that date. What made it remarkable, and what would keep it running in one form or another for nearly a century, was its structure. This was not a handful of opportunists working alone. At its height, the network drew in more than 70 women across multiple generations, aunts recruiting nieces, mothers training daughters, cousins vouching for cousins. A criminal trade passed down inside families, the same way a legitimate trade might be passed down in any other working household. Girls learned the business the way they might have learned dressmaking or millinery, except the finished product was concealment rather than clothing, and the apprenticeship was measured in successful thefts rather than in stitches per inch. Elephant and Castle itself sat at the junction of several major roads, and, by the 1890s, an increasingly important railway and tram interchange. a crossroads that made it easy for women living there to travel quickly into the West End, work a morning's circuit of department stores, and be home again by early afternoon before anyone thought to connect a respectable shopping trip with a criminal commute. Charles Booth's Poverty Survey of London, compiled through the 1880s and 1890s, mapped streets in and around the district in the darker shades of his colour-coded classifications, reserved for areas he judged chronically poor or, in his own blunt Victorian terminology, semi-criminal. It was, in other words, an area the authorities already expected trouble from, which made it, paradoxically, easier for a well-organized and well-disguised network to operate undetected. Nobody was looking for a sophisticated retail theft syndicate in a district the official maps had already written off as merely rough by the time Mary Carr had grown into a young woman in the early 1890s. She had become something the gang had not quite had before, a leader striking enough and controlled enough to hold authority over dozens of other women without needing to be the loudest voice in any room. A contemporary description in Lloyd's illustrated newspaper called her career a remarkable story of romantic crime and noted that she was noted for her good looks and engaging manners, which had gathered around her a gang of young women who gave her, in the paper's own words, complete obedience as their leader. Police records from her 1896 arrest describe a woman 5 feet 3 inches tall, with brown hair and hazel eyes, marked with a tattoo bearing the initials PGH on her right forearm, a private detail whose meaning she appears never to have explained to anyone who wrote it down. She went by other names when it suited her: Polly Carr, Mary Crane, Eva Jackson. A woman with that many names on record has, at minimum, spent a great deal of time deciding which version of herself a given room requires. The mechanics of the trade she came to lead depended on a Victorian blind spot so reliable it might as well have been written into the department store's own floor plan. Women's fashion in the period was built around volume: full skirts, layered petticoats, deep pockets sewn into underclothes, muffs, capes, and enormous hats, any one of which could conceal goods that a man's tailored suit never could. Store staff, trained in an era that treated a respectably dressed woman as inherently above suspicion, rarely searched female customers, and searching one at all risked a scene, a scandal, or worse, an accusation of impropriety against the store itself. The 40 Thieves understood this asymmetry better than the shopkeepers who suffered from it. Specially altered garments, with hidden pockets and interior hooks sewn by the gang's own seamstresses, let a woman walk into Selfridges, Gamages, or Whiteley's, looking exactly like the well-off customer the staff had been trained to leave alone, and walk out carrying goods worth more than most of those staff earned in a year. Teams of 2 or 3 worked together, one distracting a clerk with questions about fabric or fit while another worked the racks, and if confrontation came, the group simply scattered in different directions, leaving whichever assistant tried to give chase with no clear target and an empty till drawers worth of missing stock. Stolen goods rarely stayed in a thief's own hands for long. The 40 Thieves operated an entire secondary economy built around disposal, moving stolen jewelry, clothing, and household goods on to fences working out of pawnbrokers' backrooms, disreputable second-hand clothing shops, and street traders who asked no questions about where good quality silk or a barely worn coat had come from. This second layer of the operation was, in its own way, as essential as the theft itself. A hidden pocket full of stolen lace was worthless until it could be converted into cash, and the gang's ability to survive for decades depended as much on its network of buyers willing to look away as it did on the skill of the women doing the actual lifting. Consider what this meant for the women actually working the shop floor. A junior clerk who noticed a theft and said nothing kept her position. One who raised an alarm and was wrong risked her employer's fury for insulting a paying customer. One who raised an alarm and was right still had to explain to a manager who did not want to hear it exactly how so many well-dressed women had walked past her without her noticing a thing. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Now, back to the record. The trade was not without its darker edges, and the record does not allow us to soften them for the sake of a tidier story. Alongside pure shoplifting, women connected to the gang sometimes worked confidence schemes against men, approaching a gentleman on the street with a question or a favor, then following the encounter with a threatened accusation of assault or impropriety unless money changed hands, a scheme that depended on exactly the same Victorians' assumptions about female respectability that made the shoplifting so effective turned now into a weapon rather than a shield. Mary Carr herself was tried in 1890 for stealing a pocket watch in Soho, an ordinary theft charge, among what were almost certainly dozens that never made it to any surviving record at all. Then, in 1895, came a case that had nothing to do with shop counters. Carr and several of her associates were brought to trial for a vicious assault on a rival woman named Nellie Stanley, the kind of violent territorial dispute that periodically erupted between competing networks of thieves fighting over the same streets and the same fences. The charges did not stick. Carr and her co-defendants were acquitted, or the case otherwise collapsed before conviction, and she walked free from a courtroom for the second time in 5 years. Nellie Stanley's own fate afterward is not preserved in any source this record could locate, an absence that is itself worth noting. Women injured in London's criminal underworld rarely received the kind of press attention or institutional concern extended to victims further up the social scale. She survived the assault. Beyond that single documented fact, the historical record simply goes quiet, which is its own kind of verdict on whose injuries Victorian London considered worth remembering. The third case would not end so easily, and it is the one this record cannot and should not soften into simple property crime. At some point in 1895 at Epsom during the races, a 5-year-old boy named Michael McGee disappeared from his family. What exactly happened at Epsom, and what Mary Carr's own motive was, has never been fully and reliably reconstructed. Some accounts describe it as an act of spite against the boy's mother, a grievance from within the close, overlapping world of London's itinerant and criminal communities, rather than a random abduction of a stranger's child. What is documented is grimmer than any motive. The boy was kept, hidden from his family for roughly 10 months, before a tip to police led Detective Sergeant Frederick Gray of L Division to Carr's home on Stamford Street, where he found Michael McGee living with her. The boy, by then, was found to be suffering from what court records referred to only as a certain disease, language that at trial hardened into the phrase "a foul disease," a description the surviving record does not spell out further, and that this account will not speculate beyond what was actually said in court. Take a moment here, because this is not a story about a clever theft, whatever the newspapers wanted to call it. A child was missing from his family for the better part of a year. Whatever the full truth of what happened to him in that time, the court itself judged it serious enough to matter. If cases like this deserve to be remembered honestly rather than smoothed into entertainment, that is exactly what this channel is trying to do, and I would ask you to subscribe if that approach is one you value, and to tell me gently in the comments how you think a Victorian court should have weighed a child's declared affection for the woman accused of taking him. Now, back to the record. At the Old Bailey, prosecutors pursued the more serious charge of abduction, but the case that ultimately went to the jury was withdrawn down to the lesser offence of harbouring and detaining a child. Whatever happened to Michael McGee in Mary Carr's keeping, the Crown could not, or chose not to, prove the full abduction charge beyond doubt. And it was in the middle of this proceeding, with Carr dressed carefully in furs and jewelry, presenting the same respectable appearance that had shielded her gang's thefts for years, that the boy broke from where he was seated and climbed toward her, declaring, in front of the entire court, that he loved her. It is one of the strangest details to survive from any case in this record. It complicates every easy version of the story, the version where Mary Carr is simply a predator, and Michael McGee simply a victim counting the days until rescue. Whatever the truth of those 10 months, at least one person inside that courtroom, the person with the least power and the least reason to lie, did not want to be separated from her. The judge was not moved by the scene the way the boy plainly hoped he would be. Mary Carr was convicted of harboring and detaining a child and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Michael McGee was placed under the care of the Society for the Suppression of Vice, one of the era's charitable and quasi-legal bodies tasked with removing children from circumstances the state judged unfit. Placement with a body of that kind meant, in practice, an institutional childhood rather than a returned one. The surviving record does not tell us whether Michael McGee was ever reunited with his own mother, the woman whose grievance against Mary Carr may have started the entire ordeal, or what became of him afterward. He appears in this case for a matter of months, dramatically and unforgettably, and then vanishes from the historical record entirely, one more child whose fate mattered enormously to the people inside that courtroom and was never followed up in print. Carr herself was sent to Aylesbury, among the first women held at a prison that would go on to become one of the principal institutions for female convicts in England. She lost control of the 40 thieves the moment the cell door closed behind her, 3 years being more than enough time for rivals and lieutenants to carve up territory that had until then run through her alone. Aylesbury's role as a receiving prison for women was itself a recent development when Mary Carr arrived there in the late 1890s, part of a broader reorganization of the Victorian penal system that was, slowly and unevenly, separating female prisoners into dedicated institutions rather than housing them within wings of general male prisons. Holloway would follow the same path in 1903, converting fully into a women's prison and eventually becoming the institution most associated in the public imagination with London's female criminal class. Mary Carr would come to know both over the course of her career. What the system offered her, across 2 decades of arrests, was rarely rehabilitation in any meaningful sense. It offered a predictable rhythm of sentence, release, and return to the only trade that had ever reliably supported her, an economy of theft and imprisonment nearly as structured, in its own grim way, as the economy of theft and disposal she ran on the outside. She was released on license in March of 1898, and within a short time had reclaimed leadership of the gang, a fact that says as much about the loyalty she commanded as it does about how few other paths were realistically open to a woman with a prison record and a set of skills that had never included anything the respectable economy wanted to hire. By August of 1900, she was working under the alias Mary Crane, alongside a man named Charles Harvey, in a series of robberies targeting West End hotels rather than department stores, a shift in method that suggests either a widening of the gang's ambitions or simply a woman adjusting her trade to wherever the money had moved. The pair took a diamond and pearl brooch, gold cufflinks, and an expensive watch. Harvey, working beyond whatever boundaries, Carr herself observed, also stole a revolver. They were caught, committed from Marlborough Street Police Court to trial at the London Sessions in Clerkenwell, and convicted on the 11th of August that year. Officers from Holloway and from Wormwood Scrubs took the stand to testify to her prior convictions, the accumulated weight of a criminal record now stretching back more than 2 decades. Harvey received 5 years. Mary Carr received 20 months, the law once again treating her as the lesser danger in a partnership where, By any honest reading of her own history, she had at least as much claim to being the senior partner. The shift toward hotel robbery in that 1900 case is itself worth pausing on. Department stores had spent the 1890s slowly hiring more floorwalkers and installing more discreet observation posts, small, deliberate improvements that made the old shoplifting circuit marginally harder to run than it had been a decade earlier. Grand hotels, by contrast, were built entirely around the opposite instinct. Staff trained to be unobtrusive, guests expected to move freely between public rooms and private ones. Porters paid to carry luggage without asking what was inside it. A woman who had spent years reading the blind spots of department store staff needed only to redirect that same skill toward an environment with, if anything, even fewer safeguards in place. Carr and Harvey's Hall, a diamond and pearl brooch, gold cufflinks, an expensive watch, reads less like a lucky night and more like the work of two people who had correctly identified where London's wealth had started keeping its guard down. A final documented arrest came in 1905 in Bournemouth, where she was picked up alongside another woman, Louise Mitchell, on shoplifting charges. Several counts were dropped. She was convicted on one. By then, Mary Carr was well into her career as one of the most experienced operators the Metropolitan Police had ever tried to keep off the streets of the capital. A woman the newspapers had once called romantic, and whom the courts repeatedly treated as something closer to ordinary. There is a detail in her biography that belongs at the center of this record, rather than at its edges, because it says more about Victorian London than any single theft ever could. Mary Carr did not merely evade suspicion by dressing well. She was, by multiple accounts, striking enough to model for two of the most respected artists of her era, Frederick Leighton, President of the Royal Academy, and Dorothy Tennant, a well-regarded painter in her own right and later the wife of the explorer Henry Morton Stanley. Somewhere in London, in the very years Mary Carr was organizing thefts across the West End's grandest shops, her face or figure may have been hanging, respectably framed, in an exhibition that the same class of wealthy patrons she was robbing would have paid to attend. It is difficult to imagine a more precise image of the gap between how Victorian society judged beauty and how it judged crime. The same features that could earn a sitting with the President of the Royal Academy could also, worn correctly and dressed correctly, earn a woman 10 unwatched minutes inside a jeweller's counter. This record has traced a version of this same dynamic before, in cases far removed from shoplifting. A convincing manner and the right clothing bought Annie Gordon Bailey access to landowners willing to fund a settlement that never existed, and bought other women examined elsewhere in this series entry into homes and drawing rooms no honest account of their true occupation would ever have opened on its own. Mary Carr's case simply strips the same dynamic down to its most literal form. Where other women in this record used respectability to secure trust and then betrayed it slowly, over months of correspondence or performance, the 40 thieves used it in real time, for minutes at a stretch, walking in and out of a shop before the assumption of innocence had any chance to wear off. It was the same currency, it was simply spent at a different speed. That gap runs through the entire case, and it is worth naming directly rather than leaving it implied. Victorian and Edwardian institutions, courts, police, department stores alike, built their entire theory of who deserved suspicion around visible markers of class and respectability. A poorly dressed woman loitering near a counter drew a floorwalker's attention within minutes. A well-dressed woman doing the same thing was assumed, structurally and almost automatically, to belong there. The 40 thieves did not invent this bias. They simply understood it with a clarity the institutions supposedly protecting those same stores never managed to match, and they built an entire criminal economy on the gap between who looked dangerous and who actually was. It would be simpler and false to leave Mary Carr there, as a clever exploiter of a blind spot and nothing more. The record insists on more complication than that. Contemporaries described her using stolen and legitimate money alike to buy boots and food for street children who had nothing to do with her gang, to give to local charities, to post bail for associates and strangers who could not afford it themselves, and to support the families of women serving time for crimes committed on her instructions. None of this cancels the 10 months a 5-year-old boy spent away from his family, or the violence of the Nellie Stanley case, or the decades of theft that funded her generosity in the first place. It sits alongside those facts uncomfortably, the way most real human records do when they are not tidied up for the sake of a clean moral. Before we close the record on this one, I want to ask you something the case itself never resolved. A woman spends decades being protected, again and again, by exactly the assumptions about respectability that she has spent her whole career learning to weaponize, modeled by the Royal Academy's own president with one hand, arrested by Scotland Yard with the other, loved openly in open court by a child the state itself judged she had wronged. When a system built to catch the obviously dangerous keeps failing to see the actual danger standing in front of it, dressed well, smiling, difficult to read, who bears the greater responsibility for what that blindness allows to happen? Tell me what you think in the comments below. What should we do with a life this resistant to a single verdict? Mary Carr was on the documented record alone, a woman convicted of harboring a missing child, tried for a violent assault on a rival, and imprisoned twice more for theft carried out over a span of 15 years. She was also a woman who fed and clothed children who owed her nothing, who kept a network of dozens of other women, fed and housed across generations of shared risk, and who a 5-year-old boy, in the one moment the historical record lets us see him clearly, chose over the entire machinery of the state that claimed to be rescuing him. Neither fact cancels the other. This record has never promised its subjects a clean moral. It has promised only to leave in what actually happened and let it sit there unresolved the way it genuinely was. The 40 thieves outlived Mary Carr's leadership by decades. After her, the gang would be led by other women, most famously Alice Diamond in the 1920s and 1930s, and later by Shirley Pitts, who learned the trade from Diamond's own generation and carried a version of it into the middle of the 20th century, long after department store security had evolved well beyond anything Mary Carr's era ever had to contend with. Records place Mary Carr's own death in 1924, though, in keeping with nearly everything else about her, the surviving documentation of her final years is thin. A woman who spent a criminal career deliberately difficult to pin down, remaining difficult to pin down even in death. Elephant and Castle today is a district of retail parks and regenerated estates, its Victorian streets almost entirely rebuilt. No plaque anywhere, marking the corners where a syndicate of shoplifting women once trained daughters and nieces in the family trade of the specially sewn pocket. Selfridges and Whiteleys still stand, in one form or another, still selling to a clientele the store detectives still, on some level, decide to trust or distrust by appearance alone. Somewhere in a Royal Academy archive, a portrait Mary Carr sat for may still exist, catalogued under whichever name she gave the artist that particular week, hanging or stored among the respectable dead of an era that never quite managed to decide whether she belonged among them.